midnight encounter. It was the middle of the night. In the small American town of Willow Creek, the streets were empty, the wind rattling the old rooftops and clanging the iron gates. In one of the houses, 27-year-old Christopher Gray stepped outside at midnight for the first time in his life, awakened by strange sounds. At first, the noises sounded like his upstairs neighbor's footsteps, but soon they turned into the creak of stairs, then the clinking of metal. Christopher's heart began to race. He grabbed his pocket flashlight and followed the sound. The air outside was cold, the clouds hiding the moon. The noise came from the direction of an old iron bridge, a place long considered cursed in town. Years ago, someone had vanished there, but no one knew exactly what had happened. As Christopher approached, he saw a tall figure in a black coat, face hidden from view. The man carried an old, rusted black suitcase. Reaching the middle of the bridge, he stopped and began to open it. Inside were papers, faded photographs, and a small glass bottle. The liquid inside was dark, swirling gently as though it were alive. To Christopher, it felt like the bottle was staring back at him. The man turned his head, looking directly at Christopher. Even in the darkness, his eyes glinted coldly, unnaturally bright, like a flash of lightning. "You shouldn't be here," the man said quietly, but his voice chilled Christopher to the bone. Christopher took a step back, but couldn't tear his gaze away. Suddenly, the wind picked up, and from the far end of the bridge, black shapes began to emerge from the shadows. The shadows on the bridge. The shapes coming from the far end of the bridge were not human, at least not entirely. Christopher could make out elongated limbs, their movements jerky yet deliberate, as if they were both gliding and crawling at the same time. The dim light from his flashlight caught flashes of pale, stretched skin and fingers far too long to belong to a person. He felt his pulse hammering in his ears. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to obey. The man in the black coat didn't seem alarmed. Instead, he stood perfectly still, watching the shapes approach, the dark bottle in his hand reflecting faint streaks of light. "They've been waiting," the man said, his voice calm, almost reverent. "Every night, they come closer. Tonight, they've finally crossed." Christopher's throat went dry. "What are they?" The man's gaze didn't waver from the figures. "Not what? Who?" He gave a faint, bitter smile. "The ones who never left." One of the creatures let out a sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a whisper. It was a low, vibrating tone that made Christopher's ribs ache. They were halfway across the bridge now, their movements eerily synchronized, their blank, featureless faces fixed toward him. The man suddenly lifted the bottle, holding it out as if making an offering. "Do you hear them calling? This is their anchor. Without it, they fade. But with it, they feed." Christopher shook his head, stumbling back a step. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because," the man said, finally turning to face him, "you came looking. And once you look for them, they find you. Always." The shadows were close enough now that Christopher could feel the drop in temperature. His breath came out in white puffs, his fingers numb. The man stepped toward him, the bottle still in hand. "Take it," he ordered. Christopher's stomach twisted. "No." The man's smile vanished. "Then they'll take you." From behind the man, the shadows surged forward, stretching their long fingers toward Christopher. He finally turned to run, but the first icy hand brushed the back of his neck. In that single touch, a cold, electric shock shot through his body and his vision blurred. He heard the man's voice echo faintly in his head as the world began to tilt and spin. "Welcome to the other side of the bridge. The town that wasn't there." Christopher's eyes snapped open to a sky the color of bruises. Purple and gray clouds swirling in slow motion, casting a strange, dim light over the landscape. He was lying on the cold wooden planks of the bridge, but when he looked around, Willow Creek was gone. On both sides of the bridge, instead of the familiar streets and houses, there stretched a town that looked almost like his. Almost, but not quite. The buildings were in the same places, but their angles were wrong, warped as if drawn by an unsteady hand. Windows were too tall, doors too narrow, and shadows clung to every corner like living things. The air was thick, heavy, and oddly quiet. No wind, no birds. just the slow, steady sound of his own heartbeat, and something else, faint like the rustling of fabric in the distance. Christopher stood slowly, his legs unsteady. "Hello," he called. His voice sounded muffled, like it was being swallowed before it could echo. From the far end of the bridge, the man in the black coat was still there, but he seemed different. His face was now visible, pale skin stretched tight over sharp bones, eyes sunken deep, but glowing faintly with that same lightning-bright glint. The bottle was gone. "You crossed," the man said simply. "Most don't survive the first touch." Christopher swallowed hard. "Where is this?" The man tilted his head. "It's still Willow Creek, just not the one you know. This is the place it leaves behind when the living sleep. The ones who never left walk here. And now, so will you." Christopher shook his head. "No, I'm going back." The man's thin smile returned. "You think there's a way back? You think the bridge works both ways?" He stepped closer, his boots making no sound on the wood. "There's only one way to leave this place. You trade your place with someone else." The rustling sound grew louder. From the alleyways of the warped town, figures began to emerge, dozens of them. Some were tall and thin like the creatures from before. Others were shaped almost like ordinary people, but their faces were blank, smooth as porcelain. They moved slowly, but with a purpose, all turning toward Christopher. "They remember the living," the man murmured. "They miss the warmth." Christopher's chest tightened. "What do they want from me?" The man's eyes gleamed. "Everything you are." The first figure stepped onto the bridge, its faceless head tilting like it was studying him. Another followed, and another. The boards beneath his feet began to creak. Christopher took a step back toward the center of the bridge, but the man in the coat was already behind him. "You'll have to decide soon," the man whispered. "Who will walk back into your world in your place, and who will stay here forever?" The first bargain. Christopher's breathing quickened as the faceless figures drew closer. The bridge seemed narrower now, the space between him and the warped town shrinking with every step they took. The man in the black coat didn't move, but his presence behind Christopher felt like a locked door. There was no going past him without a fight. "I'm not trading places with anyone," Christopher said, forcing strength into his voice. The man's reply was almost gentle. "That's what they all say." The faceless figures were on the bridge now, their footsteps light but deliberate. One of them, slightly smaller than the rest, stopped just a few feet away. Its head tilted, and from where its mouth should have been came a soft, trembling sound like a sigh. "Do you know who that is?" the man asked. Christopher's brow furrowed. "How could I?" "Look closer," the man whispered. Against his better judgment, Christopher did. The figure's posture, the way its shoulders hunched slightly, the faint scar along its right wrist. It was familiar. His stomach dropped. "This can't be," Christopher muttered. "That's my neighbor, Mr. Hanley." The man's expression didn't change. He walked the bridge one winter night in 1989. No one ever saw him again. But here, he's been walking ever since. Christopher's pulse roared in his ears. The other faceless ones drew nearer, surrounding him in a half circle. Their heads all tilted the same way, moving as one. "They want you to choose," the man said. "One of them will go back in your place. They'll wake up in your bed tomorrow morning. No one will know the difference at first." Christopher's fists clenched. "And what happens to me?" "You'll walk here," the man said simply, "until someone trades for you. If they ever do." The smaller figure, the one that might have been Mr. Hanley, stepped closer and reached out a hand. Its palm was ice cold, but there was something desperate in its touch, like someone trying to hold onto the last thread of hope. Christopher's thoughts spun. If he refused, would they take him by force? If he agreed, would some stranger walk into his life, wearing his face, speaking in his voice, living with his memories? "You have until the end of the hour," the man said, stepping back into the fog that was beginning to curl over the bridge. "When the clock runs out, they'll decide for you." The faceless crowd began to move in a slow, circling motion around Christopher, their shapes blurring as the mist thickened. The warped skyline of the other Willow Creek faded into shadows, and the creaking of the bridge grew louder, more insistent, as though the place itself was counting down the seconds. And somewhere, faint but growing stronger, Christopher thought he heard a ticking sound. The hourglass bridge. The ticking grew louder, each beat resonating through the wooden planks beneath Christopher's feet. It wasn't the sharp tick of a clock. It was slower, heavier, like a pendulum swinging somewhere in the mist. Christopher turned in a slow circle. The faceless figures had stopped moving, their heads all angled toward the same point, the center of the bridge. There, emerging from the fog, was something that made Christopher's stomach twist. It was an hourglass, but impossibly large, nearly 10 feet tall, its glass cloudy and warped. Instead of sand, a fine black powder trickled downward, disappearing into the lower chamber like smoke slipping through cracks. Every drop landed with that slow, deliberate tick. The man in the black coat stepped forward again, his presence sudden, as though he'd been standing right behind Christopher the whole time. When the last grain falls, the bridge decides. Christopher's voice was tight. Decides what? The man's eyes glinted. Who leaves? Who stays? Who vanishes? Christopher's pulse quickened. Vanishes? The man's smile was thin. Some are not chosen for either world. The bridge swallows them whole. Even here, they cease to exist. The faceless crowd shifted, a ripple of unease passing through them. The smaller one, the one that reminded Christopher of Mr. Hanley, stepped forward again, offering its hand with urgency now. Christopher backed away. I'm not. Look closer, the man interrupted. Against his will, Christopher's eyes locked on the small figure's wrist. The scar was the same, but now he saw something else. A faint shimmer beneath its skin, like a reflection in water. In that shimmer, he saw himself, standing in his apartment, holding a cup of coffee, sunlight streaming through the blinds. It was his life, his warmth, his heartbeat, and the figure was desperate to step into it. You can't stall forever, the man said. Every tick brings the end closer. Christopher glanced at the hourglass. More than half the black powder had already fallen. The air grew colder, the mist curling tighter around them. Somewhere beyond the bridge, deep in the shadowed streets of the warped town, a low, resonant hum began to rise, the kind of sound that makes your bones ache. What happens if I just run? Christopher asked. The man chuckled softly. Run where? You're already on the bridge, and the bridge is already inside you. The words sank like stones into Christopher's mind. The faceless ones closed in again, forming two lines, one leading back toward the world he knew, the other toward the warped streets. The hourglass ticked on. He had only minutes left, and he realized whatever choice he made, someone else would pay the price. When the last grain falls, the black powder in the hourglass had nearly run out. Only a thin stream trickled from the top chamber now, each grain landing with a deep, resonant tick that seemed to vibrate inside Christopher's ribs. The faceless crowd stood utterly still, their heads all tilted toward him in silent expectation. The man in the black coat leaned against the bridge railing, calm as a judge in a courtroom. It's almost time, he murmured. Make your choice. Christopher's palms were slick with sweat despite the cold. I don't want this, he said. No one does, the man replied. That's why the bridge exists, to make the choices no one will. The smaller faceless one, the one with the scar on its wrist, stepped forward again. It didn't just hold out its hand this time. Instead, it pressed its palm against Christopher's chest, right over his heart. The chill was immediate, but there was something else, a pull, faint but growing stronger, as if the thing inside was reaching for his pulse, trying to sync with it. A vision struck him, a warm kitchen, coffee brewing, the faint sound of a radio in the background. His life, in sharp detail. Then the image shifted, the same kitchen but darker, colder wrong. The coffee was black sludge, the radio hissed with static, and there was something breathing in the shadows of the hallway. Christopher staggered back, his breath ragged. The man's voice cut through the air like a blade. If you give it your life, it will take your place. You will walk here until someone trades for you. Or you can take its place. Walk out of here warm and alive, and leave it behind forever. The final grains began to fall faster now, the ticking merging into a steady, ominous hum. The mist around the bridge thickened until Christopher could barely see the warped town or the faint outline of his own world beyond. The faceless ones began to move again, slow, synchronized steps that closed the circle around him. The boards of the bridge groaned under their weight. Christopher's heart pounded. He looked at the smaller figure's outstretched hand, then at the path behind him, empty and fading into fog. "Time," the man said softly. The very last grain of black powder slipped into the lower chamber. A deep sound, like 1,000 doors slamming shut, echoed through the mist. The hourglass shattered, black powder exploding outward, swirling around the figures like smoke. Christopher felt it cling to his skin, seeping into his clothes, his lungs. The bridge was choosing. The smaller, faceless one lunged forward, its cold hand gripping Christopher's wrist like iron. He tried to pull away, but the smoke swirled tighter, binding them together. The man in the coat only watched, his faint smile unreadable. And then the world began to split in two. The mask of the living. The bridge split down the middle with a deep, tearing sound. Not wood breaking, but something older, something that felt alive. The mist was pulled into the widening gap, spiraling down into darkness. Christopher's grip on reality faltered as the faceless figure's icy hand tightened around his wrist, dragging him toward one side, while the pull of the other world tugged at his shoulders. The man in the black coat stood perfectly still on the seam between worlds, the same faint smile playing on his lips. "The bridge has made its choice," he said, though Christopher couldn't tell if it was for him or against him. A violent jerk yanked him forward, and suddenly his feet found solid ground again. He stumbled into blinding sunlight, too bright after the gloom, and collapsed onto warm asphalt. For a moment, all he could do was breathe. Cars rumbled past. Somewhere a dog barked. The air smelled of cut grass and gasoline. Willow Creek. His Willow Creek. Or so it seemed. Christopher stood slowly, his knees still trembling. The street looked exactly as it should. The bakery on the corner, the newsstand, the old oak tree with its low-hanging branch. But there was a wrongness in the way people moved. Their faces were familiar, but blurred, like a painting smeared by wet fingers. Their eyes slid past him, unfocused, as though looking through him instead of at him. He turned toward his apartment building and froze. Standing outside the door was himself. The other Christopher was laughing at something a neighbor said, his posture relaxed, his smile effortless. In his hand was a paper bag from the bakery. He looked alive, warm, human. Christopher's throat tightened. "Hey," he shouted. The other Christopher turned, and for a brief second the smile stayed, but the eyes were black, empty voids deep enough to fall into. Then they blinked, and there were his own eyes again, perfectly normal. The neighbor patted the other Christopher on the shoulder and walked away, oblivious. The double opened the apartment door and stepped inside, closing it behind him. Christopher stood frozen on the sidewalk. His pulse was a roar in his ears. He wasn't sure if he'd truly returned, or if he was now something invisible, unwanted, watching his own life from the outside. Behind him, on the far end of the street, a tall figure in a black coat stood beneath the shadow of the oak tree. Even at a distance, Christopher could feel the weight of his gaze. The man didn't move, didn't speak. He only raised one gloved hand and pointed toward the bridge. It was still there, and its door was still open. The door still open. Christopher's stomach churned as he stared down the street at the man in the black coat. The bridge shouldn't even be visible from here. It was miles away, but somehow its iron frame arched behind the figure like a black scar in the air. The mist around it writhed, as if alive, curling upward into shapes that almost looked like hands. The people of Willow Creek bustled around him, completely unaware. A woman jogged past, earbuds in, the music faintly audible. A child tugged on his mother's arm, pointing at a toy in a shop window. None of them glanced toward the impossible sight at the far end of the street. Christopher's gaze flicked back to his apartment window. Through the thin curtains, he saw his double moving about, pouring coffee, flipping through a newspaper, leaning back in the chair as if he'd lived there for years. Every gesture was his. Every movement was him. Except for one thing. When the double thought no one was watching, his head would tilt ever so slightly, listening to something that wasn't there. His lips moved silently, forming words no human mouth should be able to shape. Christopher's skin prickled. He knew what he was seeing. The thing had worn his life like a mask, but it was already fraying at the edges. A car horn blared behind him, snapping him back. The man in the black coat was no longer under the oak tree. He was closer now, standing just a few yards away on the opposite sidewalk. "You feel it, don't you?" the man said, his voice carrying easily across the noise of the street. "The gap between you and your life. It will only grow." Christopher's fists clenched. "Give it back." The man's faint smile didn't change. "You can take it back, but you'll have to cross again. And this time, the price will be heavier." "What price?" The man stepped off the curb, weaving through cars without a glance. "You've already been touched by the bridge. You know it now. It knows you. The second crossing demands more than a trade. It demands a tether." Christopher swallowed hard. A tether. The man's eyes gleamed. Something, or someone, to keep you anchored when you return. Otherwise, he gestured vaguely toward the sky, where the clouds over the bridge twisted into a spiral. "The bridge will pull you back, piece by piece, until you're walking it again, without even knowing you've left." Christopher's mind raced. Who could he anchor to? His only family was gone. His few friends wouldn't understand. And asking someone to tether him sounded dangerously close to dragging them into this nightmare. "You have until nightfall," the man said, his voice low now. "After that, the door closes. And you?" He gave a slight shrug. "You fade." A sudden breeze swept down the street, cold enough to make Christopher's teeth chatter. When he looked up, the man was gone. Only the far-off shadow of the bridge remained, framed against the unnatural spiral in the clouds. Christopher turned back to his apartment window. His double was staring straight at him now, unmoving, coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. Even from here, Christopher could see that the eyes were no longer his own. They were black again, and this time they didn't blink. The tether. Christopher backed away from his own apartment window as the double continued to stare, unblinking, coffee cup frozen in place. His breath fogged in the warm afternoon air, an unnatural chill creeping into his bones. That stare wasn't just watching him, it was holding him in place like invisible fingers wrapping around his mind. He turned sharply and walked away, forcing himself not to look back. The bridge loomed faintly at the far end of the street, its mist still writhing, pulling at the edges of his vision. He had until nightfall, but the man's words echoed in his head. "You'll need a tether." He thought of the few people who might even answer his call. An old college friend, Mark, who lived 2 streets over. The waitress at Murphy's Diner who always remembered his order. His downstairs neighbor, Sarah, who sometimes brought him cookies at Christmas. But dragging any of them into this would be condemning them to see what he had seen. And yet, without someone to hold him in place, the bridge would take him back even if he won. By the time he reached the diner, the lunch crowd had thinned. The air smelled of coffee and fried onions. Sarah was there, not in her apartment, but sitting alone at a booth, flipping through a worn paperback. Christopher froze. She looked up, smiling faintly. "Hey, Chris, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." For a moment, he almost laughed at the understatement. "Something like that," he murmured, sliding into the booth. They talked, or rather, she talked, filling the silence with stories about her cat knocking over plants, the neighbor's kid learning to ride a bike, the town's plans for the fall festival. But Christopher barely heard her. He kept glancing at the window, where the street outside seemed slightly dimmer than it should be. Then he saw him. The man in the black coat stood on the far sidewalk, just beyond the glass, his gaze fixed on Sarah. Not on Christopher, on her. He raised one gloved hand and tapped a single finger against the window, slow and deliberate. Christopher's mouth went dry. Sarah glanced at him. "What's wrong?" He forced a smile. "Nothing." But inside, his thoughts were racing. He's already chosen. She's the tether. The man's faint smile widened, just enough for Christopher to see. He knew exactly what Christopher was thinking, and he wanted him to know there was no other choice. Sarah reached across the table and touched his hand. You're really pale, Chris. Do you need to go home? He shook his head. No, but I need you to do something for me tonight. Sure. What is it? Christopher glanced toward the window again. The man in the black coat was gone. The street outside looked normal again. But he knew better. He had until sundown to bring her to the bridge. And once she was there, he wasn't sure who would walk back. Nightfall on the bridge. By the time the sun began to sink, the air over Willow Creek felt different, heavier, as if the entire town was holding its breath. The sky turned the color of cooling ash, streaked with deep red, and the spiral of clouds above the bridge grew darker, its rotation slower, more deliberate. Christopher stood outside Sarah's apartment, his hands shoved deep in his pockets to hide the tremor in them. Every step toward this moment had been a knot tightening in his chest, but now the rope was burning. Sarah emerged, locking her door. She wore a light jacket and had that same friendly, slightly puzzled look she'd given him earlier. So, where are we going? Christopher forced a smile. It's hard to explain, but I need you to trust me. She studied him for a moment. All right, just tell me this isn't some weird prank. It's not, he said softly. It's not a joke at all. They walked in silence, the streets growing quieter with every block. Street lamps flickered as they passed, their light dimming and swelling in an unnatural rhythm, like the town itself was aware of their destination. Christopher kept glancing behind them, half expecting to see the man in the black coat. But there was nothing, and that absence was worse. When they turned the final corner, the bridge rose before them. It looked almost normal from this distance, but the mist swirling at its edges had grown thicker, darker, and when the wind shifted, the air smelled faintly of iron. Sarah slowed. Chris, why does it look like that? He swallowed hard. Because it's not just a bridge. They stepped onto the wooden planks. The moment Sarah's foot touched them, the air changed. A deep, resonant hum vibrated up through the boards, traveling into their bones. The mist curled inward, swallowing the view of the town behind them. Halfway across, the man in the black coat appeared. One moment there was only fog. The next he was standing in the center, hands folded neatly in front of him. You brought her, he said, voice carrying easily despite the distance. Good. Sarah froze. Chris, who is that? Someone who knows the way back, Christopher said quietly. But it's complicated. The man stepped aside, revealing an object behind him. An hourglass, smaller than before, but the sand inside was white this time, glowing faintly. The black hourglass had counted down to the bridge's choice. This one, Christopher realized, was counting something else entirely. This is the tether, the man said, gesturing toward Sarah. She will hold you in place. But to do that, she must give something of herself. Sarah turned sharply. What does he mean? Christopher's voice cracked. It means you will lose a part of you. A memory. A feeling. Maybe more. But if you don't, I'll be trapped there forever. The man's smile was faint but sharp. Choose quickly. When the last grain falls, the bridge will claim him again. And next time, there will be no tether strong enough to pull him back. Sarah stared at him, then at Christopher. Why me? Because you're the only one I trust, he whispered. The first grain of white sand fell. The price of the tether. The white sand glowed faintly as it fell through the narrow neck of the hourglass, each grain dissolving into a brief spark before vanishing in the lower chamber. The hum beneath the bridge deepened, and the mist thickened until the world beyond was nothing but shifting gray. Sarah's breath came faster, her eyes darting between Christopher and the man in the black coat. If I do this, what exactly am I giving up? The man tilted his head, as if savoring the question. That depends. The bridge takes what it needs most from you. Sometimes it is a single memory. Sometimes it is a name. Sometimes it is the face of someone you love. You will not know until it is gone. Sarah's hands tightened at her sides. And if I refuse? Christopher's voice was low, urgent. Then the bridge takes me. Forever. The man stepped closer, the wooden planks beneath him not making a sound. And when it takes him, he said softly, it will not be kind. He will walk here until his shape fades into the mist, until he is no different from those who have walked for centuries without form, without name. You will never see him again. Sarah's eyes locked on Christopher's.